The Alpha King ordered everyone to ignore the rejected Omega. Then his wolf broke royal law. Welcome, everyone. Before we step into today's unforgettable story, we'd love to ask for one small favor. If you enjoy powerful tales of courage, destiny, and unforgettable love, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our newest stories. It only takes a moment, costs nothing, and your support helps us continue creating heartfelt adventures like this one. Thank you for being part of our journey. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We always love discovering how these stories connect people across different countries and time zones. And now, without further delay, let's begin today's story. If a king commands the world to look away, but his own wolf refuses to obey, which one is truly in control? No one in the Northern Kingdom dared ask that question aloud, because everyone believed the answer had been settled generations ago. The Alpha King ruled above every pack, every noble family, every oath sworn beneath the moon. His word carried the weight of law, and no wolf challenged it. At least, that was what the kingdom had believed until the day Elena Whitmore walked into the Hall of Silver Pines wearing a faded blue dress that seemed far too simple for the grand ceremony unfolding beneath crystal chandeliers and towering marble pillars. She kept her chin lowered, not because she lacked dignity, but because years of rejection had taught her that meeting another wolf's eyes usually invited ridicule instead of kindness. Conversations faded as she entered. Some nobles looked through her, as though she were nothing more than drifting fog. Others exchanged quiet smiles that barely concealed their contempt. They all knew who she was. The rejected Omega without a scent. The young woman no Alpha had ever claimed. The quiet healer whose gentle hands could comfort frightened children and injured animals, but earned no respect in a kingdom that admired strength above compassion. Elena ignored the whispers and continued forward with calm, measured steps. She had not come expecting acceptance. She had only come because every unmated wolf had been ordered to attend the royal choosing ceremony, where King Lucian Ashcroft would announce the future Luna of the realm. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows, painting silver wolves across the polished stone floor. At the far end of the magnificent hall stood the obsidian throne, carved from ancient black stone that legends claimed had fallen from the stars themselves. Upon it sat King Lucian Ashcroft. His posture was perfectly still. His expression revealed nothing. Silver eyes swept across the hundreds gathered before him with quiet authority, missing nothing and revealing even less. He looked exactly like the ruler every story described, disciplined, composed, impossible to read. When his gaze briefly settled on Elena, there was no spark of recognition, no curiosity, not even annoyance. Only silence. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke words that spread through the hall like winter wind across frozen water. The rejected Omega is not to be disturbed. No one will speak to her, guide her, assist her, or acknowledge her presence during today's ceremony. There was no outrage, no questions, only immediate obedience. Noble families lowered their eyes. Servants stepped away from her path. Musicians pretended not to notice her standing alone beneath the enormous silver banners of the royal crest. Within seconds, Elena became invisible while standing in the very center of the kingdom. The order itself felt colder than any insult she had ever endured because it required no cruelty to accomplish its purpose. It simply erased her. Elena drew one slow breath, folded her trembling hands together, and stood quietly as though she had practiced disappearing her entire life. Somewhere beyond the towering palace windows, a distant wolf howled beneath the afternoon sky. No one inside the hall reacted. No one except King Lucian, whose heartbeat unexpectedly skipped for the first time in years as something ancient stirred deep within the silent darkness of his royal wolf. Elena remained exactly where she had been told to stand, surrounded by hundreds of wolves yet, separated from every one of them by a single royal command. Time seemed to move differently inside the great hall. Laughter drifted from elegant circles of noble families. Crystal glasses reflected warm afternoon light. Servants carried silver trays filled with fresh fruit, warm bread, and sparkling cider. But every path curved naturally around Elena, as though an invisible wall stood between her and the rest of the kingdom. No one bumped into her. No one greeted her. Even accidental eye contact vanished before it could exist. The order was being followed with remarkable precision, and somehow that made it hurt more than open mockery ever had. Elena folded her hands together and reminded herself to breathe slowly. She had learned long ago that dignity often survived in silence when nothing else remained. Memories surfaced without permission. She remembered being 10 years old when other children had rushed toward a frightened wolf pup trapped beneath a fallen branch. They had been too afraid to touch it, but Elena had quietly knelt beside the trembling creature until its breathing slowed. She remembered an elderly healer once whispering that gentleness was a rare gift, not a weakness. Yet every year afterward, the kingdom had taught her the opposite. Strength earned applause. Kindness was overlooked. Compassion was expected but never celebrated. Across the hall, King Lucian watched another noble family present their daughter with polished confidence and carefully rehearsed smiles. Every introduction sounded nearly identical. Every promise of loyalty blended into the next until even the applause felt rehearsed. He listened because it was expected, but his thoughts refused to remain focused. Something deep inside him had become strangely restless. His royal wolf, normally as disciplined as a seasoned guardian, paced through the hidden corners of his mind with quiet determination. There was no anger, no warning, only an unfamiliar pull that seemed to come from somewhere beyond instinct itself. Lucian ignored it. He had spent his entire life mastering absolute control. A king who could not command himself had no right to command a kingdom. High Elder Rowan stepped beside the throne with measured steps that revealed decades of wisdom. His silver hair shimmered beneath the stained glass light as he quietly observed the gathering. Without looking directly at the king, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty, some silences carry consequences longer than spoken words." Lucian answered without turning his head. "The kingdom requires order before sentiment." The elder gave a thoughtful nod, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Order built without mercy sometimes awakens what history hoped would remain asleep. Before Lucian could ask what he meant, the elder had already stepped back into the line of royal advisors. Meanwhile, Elena noticed something no one else seemed to see. Near one of the towering marble columns, an elderly white wolf rested quietly in the shadows beyond the ceremonial guests. Its fur carried the soft glow of moonlight despite the bright afternoon, and one front paw appeared injured. Palace guards walked past without acknowledging the animal, almost as though it did not exist. The old wolf lifted calm silver eyes toward Elena. There was no fear in its expression, only patience, as if it had been waiting for someone who could still see what others had forgotten. Elena hesitated only for a heartbeat before taking a careful step toward the quiet creature, unaware that somewhere deep inside the king, his royal wolf suddenly stopped pacing and stood perfectly still. Elena slowed her steps until even the soft brush of her shoes against the polished stone became almost silent. Around her, the ceremony continued as though nothing unusual existed beyond polished speeches and carefully measured smiles. Yet the elderly white wolf remained motionless beside the marble column. It did not beg for help. It did not whimper. It simply watched her with patient silver eyes that reflected a wisdom far older than the palace itself. She glanced around carefully. The nearest servants walked within only a few feet of the animal without acknowledging its presence. Noble guests passed by while discussing alliances and royal traditions, never once looking toward the quiet creature. It was as though the wolf belonged to a world hidden just beneath the one everyone else believed they understood. Elena knelt slowly, keeping her movements calm so she would not frighten it. The injured paw rested gently against the cool floor, and only now did she notice a thin line of dried dust caught between the white fur. It was not a serious injury, only enough to make each step uncomfortable. She smiled with quiet warmth. "You have been walking alone for a long time, have not you?" she whispered. The wolf blinked once, almost as if it understood every word. Elena carefully reached into the small pouch tied beneath her sleeve. As a healer, she always carried simple herbs gathered from the hills surrounding her village. They were ordinary plants, nothing magical, yet they had eased countless aches and tired muscles through the years. She crushed a few leaves gently between her fingertips, adding a single drop of water from the small flask at her belt before placing the cool mixture across the wolf's paw with remarkable tenderness. The old wolf never pulled away. Instead, It lowered its great head until its nose rested briefly against the back of Elena's hand. Warmth spread through her fingers, soft as morning sunlight after a long winter. She paused, surprised by the feeling. It was not painful. It was not frightening. It simply felt familiar, as though an invisible heartbeat had quietly answered her own. Tiny threads of silver light shimmered beneath her skin for only an instant before disappearing completely. Elena looked around, wondering if anyone else had seen them. No one had. The ceremony continued uninterrupted. Yet somewhere across the hall, King Lucian suddenly gripped the arm of the obsidian throne. His breathing remained steady, but inside his mind the royal wolf surged forward with unmistakable urgency. For the first time since he had inherited the crown, the ancient beast ignored every command to remain still. Images flashed through Lucian's thoughts like reflections upon moonlit water. An old forest, a circle of standing stones, a woman whose face remained hidden beneath silver light. A voice older than memory whispered only 4 words. The forgotten promise returns. Lucian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second before forcing the vision away. Kings did not surrender to dreams in the middle of royal ceremonies. Kings mastered themselves. Yet his wolf refused to settle. Across the chamber, the elderly white wolf slowly rose to its feet. The limp had completely vanished. It gazed at Elena with quiet gratitude before taking 3 deliberate steps backward into the long shadows cast by the towering columns. For a single heartbeat, the palace seemed strangely silent. Then the wolf disappeared, not by running, not by hiding, but as though the shadows themselves had gently welcomed it home. Elena stared at the empty space, uncertain whether she had imagined the entire encounter. As she lowered her hand, however, she noticed something that had not been there before. Resting against the inside of her wrist was a delicate silver marking shaped like a crescent moon wrapped around the outline of a royal wolf, faint enough to escape ordinary notice, yet beautiful enough to steal the breath from anyone who understood the oldest legends that even the royal court believed had vanished centuries before. The faint silver mark upon Elena's wrist faded beneath her sleeve before anyone nearby could notice it. Yet she could not ignore the quiet warmth lingering beneath her skin. She gently lowered her hand and returned to her place near the edge of the grand hall, convincing herself that whatever had just happened belonged to the strange silence surrounding the mysterious white wolf rather than to her own life. The royal choosing ceremony continued with flawless precision. Noble families presented gifts crafted from polished oak, carved crystal, and rare mountain silver. Musicians filled the palace with graceful melodies while servants moved through the crowd with practiced elegance. Everything appeared exactly as tradition demanded. Only one thing had changed. King Lucian Ashcroft could no longer hear the music. His attention remained fixed upon the invisible tension building somewhere beyond reason. His royal wolf had never questioned him before. It had always accepted every command with perfect discipline, standing beside him. Through difficult decisions, dangerous winters, and countless ceremonies. Today, however, the ancient creature refused to rest. Instead of calm obedience, Lucian felt a steady pull drawing his senses toward the far side of the chamber where the rejected Omega quietly stood alone. He resisted the impulse immediately. There was no logical explanation for it. She possessed no remarkable scent, no visible rank, no political influence. Every lesson he had learned insisted she should mean nothing to the future of the crown. Yet his heartbeat betrayed a truth his mind refused to accept. High Elder Rowan observed the king without speaking. Years of serving the royal family had taught him to recognize changes too subtle for others to notice. The king's posture remained perfect, but his fingers rested slightly tighter upon the carved arm of the obsidian throne. His breathing remained controlled, though a faint hesitation appeared between each measured breath. Rowan quietly lifted his eyes toward the stained glass ceiling where sunlight poured through images of ancient wolves guarding a radiant moon. A distant memory stirred inside the old scholar's heart, one spoken only within forgotten records that few living wolves had ever been permitted to read. Before he could gather his thoughts, the master of ceremonies stepped forward and announced the beginning of the royal banquet. The enormous bronze doors opened, revealing a magnificent dining hall stretching nearly 100 yards beneath soaring arches supported by white stone columns. Long tables shimmered beneath hundreds of candles whose gentle light reflected from polished silver plates and crystal goblets. Guests applauded respectfully as King Lucian rose from his throne to lead the procession. Elena waited until nearly everyone else had entered before quietly following at the very end, honoring the order that no one acknowledge her presence. She expected another evening of silence, another reminder that she existed only where others chose not to look. As Lucian crossed the entrance into the banquet hall, something inside him suddenly awakened with astonishing force. His royal wolf surged forward so powerfully that he instinctively paused mid-step. An unfamiliar emotion flooded through him. It was neither anger nor fear. It felt like recognition reaching across centuries. The sensation stole the air from his lungs for a single heartbeat. His eyes lifted almost against his own will until they found Elena standing alone beneath a tall window where fading afternoon light surrounded her like a quiet silver halo. At that exact moment, the hidden mark beneath her sleeve shimmered softly once more. No ordinary eye could have seen it. Yet the royal wolf saw everything. Deep within Lucian's soul, the ancient guardian released a single powerful call that echoed through every corner of his mind, not with sound, but with absolute certainty. And for the first time since ascending the throne, the Alpha King realized there existed a force older than his authority, older than the palace itself, and it had just recognized someone he had commanded the entire kingdom to ignore. The entire banquet hall seemed to hold its breath without understanding why. King Lucian remained standing at the head of the royal table, while distinguished guests waited for him to offer the traditional welcome that officially began the evening feast. He had spoken those familiar words every year since ascending the throne, yet tonight they refused to leave his lips. His royal wolf had become completely silent, not because it had surrendered, but because it was listening to something no human ear could hear. Lucian slowly turned his head once again toward the far end of the hall. Elena stood exactly where she had chosen to remain, careful not to interfere with anyone around her. She neither sought attention nor complained about the loneliness surrounding her. She simply accepted the empty space others had created. For reasons he could not explain, that quiet acceptance unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. Then it happened. A single silver line appeared across the polished marble floor beneath Elena's feet. At first it looked like nothing more than a reflection cast by the evening light, but within moments another line emerged, then another, each one glowing with a gentle radiance that spread outward. In graceful circles, guests nearest the strange light stepped back in startled silence. Conversations faded. Music stopped. Even the palace candles seemed to flicker as though responding to an invisible wind. Elena lowered her eyes in confusion. She had not moved. She had touched nothing. Yet ancient symbols unlike any she had ever seen continued unfolding beneath her, forming elegant patterns that resembled wolves running beneath a full moon. The silver mark hidden beneath her sleeve warmed once more, and the glowing designs answered with a brighter pulse. Across the hall, Lucian felt his heartbeat echo with impossible force. His royal wolf surged forward, no longer asking permission. Deep within his soul, the ancient guardian bowed its head with profound respect toward the young woman standing alone among the gathered nobles. Lucian instinctively resisted the overwhelming impulse pressing against his mind. Kings did not kneel without reason. Kings did not surrender authority to instinct. Yet the force within him continued growing stronger, carrying neither anger nor rebellion, only absolute certainty. High Elder Rowan stepped forward, his weathered face suddenly drained of color. His eyes widened as he stared at the luminous markings spreading across the marble. His voice barely rose above a whisper, but in the complete silence every word carried throughout the hall. The royal law. Several advisors exchanged puzzled glances. Younger nobles frowned, unfamiliar with the ancient phrase. Rowan slowly lowered one hand toward the glowing symbols without touching them. I believe these sacred markings had vanished from the world centuries ago. Elena looked toward the elder with quiet uncertainty. I do not understand. I did not do this. Rowan gently shook his head. No, child. That is exactly why they have appeared. The silver light continued expanding until it reached the foot of the royal dais. Every glowing line stopped precisely before King Lucian. The hall became so still that the faint crackling of candle flames sounded impossibly loud. Lucian tried to command his wolf to remain still one final time. Instead, the ancient guardian took complete control. For a single breathtaking moment, without anger, without hesitation, and without a single spoken command, the royal wolf compelled the Alpha King to take one deliberate step away from his throne and toward the woman he had ordered the entire kingdom to ignore, while every witness stood frozen, realizing they were watching a mystery older than the crown itself awaken before their very eyes. No one moved. Hundreds of wolves stood in complete silence as the silver markings across the marble floor continued to glow with a quiet brilliance that seemed untouched by the flickering candlelight surrounding them. King Lucian stopped after taking that single unexpected step, every instinct urging him to regain control, yet his royal wolf remained calm and unwavering. It was not forcing him forward through anger. It was inviting him to witness a truth that had waited far longer than his reign. Elena remained perfectly still, uncertain whether she should retreat or remain where she stood. She had never sought attention, and now every eye in the kingdom rested upon her. The silver warmth beneath her sleeve pulsed gently once, then faded, leaving only the faint outline of the ancient mark hidden against her skin. High Elder Rowan slowly walked into the circle of glowing symbols, his expression filled not with fear but with reverence. He knelt carefully, placing one hand a few inches above the marble without touching it. His eyes closed for a brief moment before opening again with quiet amazement. "These are not ordinary symbols," he said softly. "They belong to the First Covenant." Murmurs spread through the hall. Younger nobles exchanged confused glances, while the oldest members of the court lowered their heads as though they had just heard a forgotten prayer spoken aloud. One royal advisor finally stepped forward. "The First Covenant is only a legend," he insisted. Rowan turned toward him with gentle patience. "Legends survive because someone forgets they were once history." The hall fell silent again. Rowan faced the gathered court, his voice carrying naturally through the enormous chamber. Long before crowns, before kingdoms, before wolves divided themselves into ranks, the moon goddess established one sacred promise for every royal bloodline. A king could govern lands. A king could command armies. A king could create laws for his people. But no king would ever stand above the royal law. Several guests looked toward King Lucian, whose expression remained calm despite the growing uncertainty inside him. Rowan continued, "The royal law exists to protect what ambition cannot replace and what power must never destroy. If a royal wolf knowingly abandons the one chosen beneath the sacred moon, the wolf itself remembers the covenant, even when its master does not." Elena listened without fully understanding why every sentence seemed to echo inside her heart. She quietly whispered, "Why would such a law awaken now?" Rowan looked at her with kind eyes. "Because kindness has a voice older than authority." His answer puzzled nearly everyone present. But before another question could be asked, a gentle breeze drifted through the banquet hall, although every window remained closed. The silver markings shimmered once more before slowly changing shape. The wolves carved within the glowing lines now faced not the throne, but Elena herself. A collective breath swept through the room. Lucian felt the change immediately. His royal wolf lowered its head in complete respect, a gesture it had never offered another living soul. The king understood at last that this was not a challenge to his crown. It was a reminder that the crown itself had always answered to something greater. As the final silver light settled across the ancient symbols, Rowan lifted his eyes toward the royal family crest hanging above the throne and quietly spoke words that no royal record had carried for centuries. "The covenant has awakened because the kingdom forgot that compassion is the first duty of every true alpha, and now the royal law has returned to teach the crown what history could not." The silence that followed High Elder Rowan's final words felt heavier than any royal decree ever spoken within the palace walls. No one applauded. No one argued. Even the most influential nobles lowered their eyes, unable to explain why their confidence had suddenly given way to quiet uncertainty. King Lucian remained standing where he had stopped, only a few measured steps away from the throne that had always symbolized unquestioned authority. For the first time since accepting the crown, he realized authority alone could not answer every truth. His royal wolf remained perfectly calm, yet it no longer stood beside him as a loyal servant waiting for commands. Instead, It faced Elena with unwavering respect, as though recognizing a promise written long before Lucian had ever been born. The feeling unsettled him more deeply than anger ever could. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, searching his memories for any lesson his father or grandfather might have taught him about the First Covenant or the royal law. There was nothing. He had mastered diplomacy, leadership, and tradition. He had memorized every law carved into the royal archives. Yet no one had prepared him for a law that judged the heart instead of the throne. Across the hall, Elena felt every curious gaze resting upon her, but she refused to let fear shape her expression. She had spent years being overlooked, and now that everyone finally saw her, she found no satisfaction in their attention. She only wished the strange light upon the floor would disappear so peace could return to the room. She quietly looked toward High Elder Rowan. "If I have caused trouble for the kingdom, I am truly sorry." Her words echoed gently through the chamber. Several nobles looked surprised that the young woman who had been ignored all day chose humility instead of pride. Rowan smiled kindly. "You did not awaken this moment. Your compassion did." Lucian heard those words with unexpected clarity. His thoughts returned to the order he had given only hours earlier. Ignore her. At the time, he had believed emotional distance protected the dignity of the ceremony and prevented unnecessary distractions. Now the memory sounded painfully different. Without raising his voice or showing open cruelty, he had allowed an innocent person to become invisible before the entire kingdom. The realization settled heavily upon his conscience. He slowly turned toward the assembled court. Every noble family waited for his next command. Every servant stood motionless. Every royal guard remained perfectly still. The king understood that whatever he said next would shape how history remembered this day. Yet before he could speak, his royal wolf gently interrupted him once again. There was no struggle for control this time. Instead, an unmistakable feeling filled his heart, one he had never experienced before. It was regret, not for losing authority, but for failing to recognize quiet goodness when it had stood directly before him. Lucian finally lifted his eyes to meet Elena's. She did not look away. There was no resentment in her expression, no triumph, only quiet honesty. In that simple exchange, the king recognized something more powerful than admiration. He saw courage that had survived rejection without becoming bitterness. He saw kindness that had remained generous despite receiving almost none in return. Deep within his soul, his royal wolf lowered its head once again, and this time Lucian did not resist. He understood at last that the greatest shame of a ruler was never making a mistake. The greatest shame was possessing the power to see goodness and choosing not to see it at all. King Lucian took a slow breath before descending the final steps from the royal dais. Every movement echoed through the silent banquet hall, not because of the sound of his footsteps, but because no alpha king had ever walked away from the throne during the royal choosing ceremony. The nobles instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path between the king and the young woman they had ignored only moments before. Elena watched him approach with quiet uncertainty. She did not bow immediately. She did not retreat. She simply waited, believing there must be some royal duty she had unknowingly interrupted. Lucian stopped several feet away, allowing the silence to linger before speaking. "Elena Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but carrying throughout the chamber. "Today I asked my kingdom to pretend you did not exist." No one dared interrupt him. I believed I was protecting tradition. Instead, I allowed tradition to become an excuse for indifference. His words settled over the gathered court like gentle rain after a long season of drought. Many lowered their heads, recognizing that they had followed his command without questioning whether it had been right. Lucian slowly placed one hand over his heart, an ancient gesture reserved for promises made before the moon goddess. Gasps quietly spread through the hall. The gesture was rarely performed outside sacred ceremonies. A king who cannot recognize quiet goodness does not deserve unquestioned loyalty, he continued. If my example taught this kingdom to overlook compassion, then the fault begins with me. Elena looked at him with surprise. She had expected an explanation, perhaps another command, but not an admission spoken before the entire royal court. She gently shook her head. "Your Majesty, I do not wish to see anyone humiliated because of me." Her answer carried neither anger nor accusation. It carried only sincerity. High Elder Rowan smiled softly. as though hearing the very quality the first covenant had waited centuries to find. Lucian understood then that asking forgiveness with words alone would never be enough. He looked toward the assembled nobles, advisors, guards, and servants who had faithfully obeyed his earlier command. From this day forward, he declared, no wolf shall be judged by rank before character or by status before kindness. The royal court will review every custom that allows dignity to be withheld from those who have done no wrong. A quiet murmur swept through the chamber. The announcement reached far beyond Elena. It challenged traditions that had shaped generations. Lucian then returned his attention to her. I cannot ask you to erase what happened today, he said honestly. Trust cannot be commanded. It must be earned. Elena studied his face for a long moment. She saw no pride hiding behind his words and no expectation that forgiveness should come easily. Then let your actions become the answer, she replied gently. Do not change the kingdom for me alone. Change it for every Omega, every child, and every wolf who has ever believed they were invisible. Those simple words carried more wisdom than the grand speeches spoken throughout the entire ceremony. Lucian slowly nodded. That is the promise I choose to make. At that very moment, the silver markings upon the marble floor glowed one final time before dissolving into countless tiny points of light that drifted upward like peaceful stars, while somewhere beyond the palace walls a distant white wolf lifted its voice beneath the rising evening moon, as though the ancient guardians themselves had accepted the first step toward restoring a kingdom that would finally remember that true strength begins with compassion. Morning sunlight washed across the palace courtyard only a few weeks later, illuminating a kingdom that already felt different from the one Elena Whitmore had entered on the day of the royal choosing ceremony. The changes had not appeared through grand celebrations or dramatic proclamations alone. They revealed themselves in quiet moments. Young Omegas now walked through the royal gardens without lowering their heads. Palace servants greeted every visitor with equal respect regardless of rank. Apprentices from distant villages were welcomed into the royal library, where knowledge was offered freely instead of guarded as a privilege reserved for the powerful. King Lucian Ashcroft understood that promises meant very little unless they became daily habits, so he spent each morning reviewing new reforms with the council, carefully removing customs that measured worth by status instead of character. Some nobles resisted. Others feared that ancient traditions were disappearing. High Elder Rowan reminded them that traditions built upon kindness never needed protection because they naturally endured. Only unfair customs demanded constant defense. Elena never asked for a title or special recognition. She returned to the healing gardens beside the eastern walls, where she continued caring for travelers, children, elderly wolves, and injured animals with the same quiet compassion she had shown long before anyone knew her name. People began seeking her not because the royal law had acknowledged her, but because her kindness had already changed countless lives. The greatest surprise came when the palace guards, once instructed to ignore her completely, voluntarily planted a small circle of white flowers outside the healing house. No plaque carried their names. No speeches marked the occasion. It was simply an act of gratitude. Lucian visited the gardens often, never expecting forgiveness to arrive quickly. Instead of offering expensive gifts, he listened. He learned the names of ordinary families. He watched Elena comfort frightened children with patient smiles and gentle encouragement. Each visit reminded him that leadership was not measured by how many obeyed his voice, but by how safe others felt in his presence. Over time, trust slowly replaced distance. It did not happen through destiny alone. It grew through consistent choices made day after day. One peaceful evening, as the first stars appeared above the palace towers, Lucian and Elena stood overlooking the valley where hundreds of warm lights glowed from homes scattered across the hills. The kingdom felt quieter than it had in many years. Do you believe people can truly change? Lucian asked softly. Elena smiled toward the distant villages. They already are. Every child who grows up believing kindness is strength instead of weakness will build a different future than the one we inherited. Her answer lingered in the evening air with gentle certainty. High Elder Rowan watched them from the palace balcony, satisfaction warming his thoughtful expression. Yet as he lifted his eyes toward the rising full moon, that peaceful smile slowly faded. High above the kingdom, Beyond the familiar constellation honored by every royal wolf, another ancient symbol briefly shimmered across the night sky before disappearing into the silver light. Rowan recognized it immediately from the oldest forgotten records even the royal law had never fully explained. He quietly whispered to himself, "The first covenant has awakened," but it was never the final covenant. Far beyond the mountains, hidden beneath forests untouched by time, something ancient answered the moon with a silent light, waiting patiently for the day the kingdom would discover that the greatest secrets of the royal wolves had only just begun to awaken.